Welcome back, everyone. This is Politics Tonight. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now, let's get straight into our conversation for tonight. While ECOWAS is welcoming a new president, John Mahama of Ghana, to its bloc, the erstwhile military junta in Niger, head of state General Abdurrahman Chani, has accused ECOWAS chairman and president of Nigeria, Bola Tinubu, of terrorism. Nigerian government alleged that Nigeria, alongside other foreign security forces, gave assistance to Lakurawa, a terrorist group. The accusation has since been debunked by Nigeria's Minister of Information, Mohammed Idris. But to help us make sense of the issue and other regional matters, I am now being joined live from Abuja studio by Abiodun Adeniyi, Professor of Communication Studies, Bayes University. Professor, good evening to you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us on Politics Tonight.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Prof, good evening to you. Can you hear me? All right.
I can hear you clearly. Good evening.
Right. In recent times, we've heard Niger Republic make bold allegations against some Nigerian authorities, claiming they are complicit in sponsoring terrorism across West Africa. Surprisingly or not, the president accused the federal government of being paid by President Macron for Nigeria military base. Our Minister of Information calls these accusations baseless. How bold would you consider these statements?
Well, I think we need to understand the context within which the government of Niger is operating. It is a military regime, and we know what military regimes represent. It's an aberration. It's a kind of regime that is losing steam in global affairs. And of course, when they come to power, the one thing they want to do is to look for legitimacy and to look for fall entities, fall countries, if you want. And because of our shared history, our shared memories, and our common heritage, remember that we share contiguous borders with Niger. We are one country that Niger will want to easily hit at, against the background of our earlier threat, rightly or wrongly, to restore democracy in that country using military. Yes, we didn't carry out that threat, but it might still matter to them to continue to use that as a moral high ground. But of course, we know that what they are just trying to do is to push back at us, to denigrate us, diminish us, and make us look like the bad guy, the fall guys, considering the moral poverty, that they wallow in as a military government that is discredited in the century that we are in. And we need to also put things within the historical framework that they belong, Niger is an illustrious country, looking at their history. That's the country that once hosted the great Mansa Musa in the old Mali Empire. That's the country that bears one of Africa's illustrious heritage, the city of Timbuktu with its wonderful architecture. And that's the country as well that will share boundaries with Nigeria's Kanem-Borno Empire. And of course, we have common histories at the level of language, at the level of custom, at the level of religion. So we are born, there's a deep-seated kind of bondedness between us two. The military ruler obviously know that we cannot successfully be separated from them, even though we want to do it at the level of state affairs. It's going to be difficult for us to do it at the level of people. And as the bigger brother, the bigger entity, we want to be elevated, above their intransigence, whether through rhetoric, or through pronouncements. And it's often expected that if he wants to take a shot at any country in the West African subcontinent, in the subcontinent of in the West African region, we are most likely going to remain his target. And that's what he's simply doing. So I do not think that is something that Nigeria should take seriously. It's just going to be a storm in a teacup. He's just trying to look for a ground on which he can portray himself and his country as good, while Nigeria is bad, unfortunately. It's not going to go anywhere. We are not obliged to him in any regard. We are a sovereign country, and beyond our sovereignty, we are the most populous in Africa. In terms of military might, it may not matter really, but of course we are far ahead of them. We have been helpful to them in many regards, even in our recent history under the former President Muhammadu Buhari.
Prof, let me come in there because
so many things that we can share.
The question some Nigerians have asked is, what exactly would Nigeria gain in causing instability of any kind in a country like Niger? Some say Niger is an inconsequential neighbor, so why? And you may not want to blame those saying such, not forgetting also that for years Nigeria has supported peace and security of several countries, not only in the West African sub-region but also on the African continent. And despite all of these efforts, how worried are you that this is coming at this time, considering the recent successes recorded by the multinational joint task force which Nigeria leads?
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me. I heard you up to a point, but the argument I'm actually making is that there's actually no substance in what Chiani is saying. You're looking at a group of countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, that have formed an alliance. And what is that alliance supposed to be for? It's going to be a kind of alliance that should help their desire to hold on to power, considering the groundswell of global opinion against military regime. And of course, agitations in Africa have always been for democracy. And if you want to be dictatorial in any way, or you want to be anti-democratic in any way, it has to be effectively people-oriented, which can always be very, very difficult. So on what ground really are they going to legitimize their say? It's a very difficult question they cannot answer, and one way to answer it really is to throw darts at fellow African countries, and Nigeria is closest to them, or one of the closest countries to them. So we can easily, against that background, we can easily become a target for them. And that's why he's just looking for the least option, and that least option is just to face us as a people. But it shouldn't really provoke us, as a country, because we are bigger. Obviously, we should be slightly elevated above the provocations. And of course, in international politics, we often need to prioritize diplomacy, over conflict. Diplomacy is priceless. Diplomacy is noble, is dignifying, and it's something that is cherished, in cross-country relationship. And of course, it's even more so when we're talking about a country that will have shared histories and memories, and of course, common heritage. So terrorism, of course, we know is a global affair, and it's been troubling in the West African region in the last couple of years, and even much more so in the Sahel region, North Africa, considering the conflict in Libya and some other parts around parts around that section of the continent. And we know the trouble we're also having down around the West African region is coming from the proliferation of small and light arms, coming from that part. So we need all kinds of cooperation, but within the quest for cooperation will also be distractions. And I'm seeing the pronouncement of General Chiani as one of those distractions. It's not something that Nigeria should be worried about, other than to deploy diplomatic means in dealing with it. I do not imagine us, coming down to the level at which he wants to bring us. Because all he's trying to do is to rationalize his position alongside his co-travelers in Mali and Burkina Faso, considering how illegitimate their regime can be. It's a regime that is always fraught with anxiety, with uncertainty, because how do you expect them to change guards, for instance? It's steeped in uncertainties, considering how we know military regimes to be, and it's a very dangerous path to tread, not a path that we want. If you look at the values embedded in democracy, which is often preached about, how involving and integrating it can be, how representative it can be. If you also look at the African continent, the African peoples, as people that lack cohesion, where their self-esteem always has to be boosted, considering long years of poverty, long years of disease, and the disrespect that we'll presently have in global affairs. One way in which
Prof,
you can bring
you
about respect is to ensure
Prof, you talked about substance, and I'm wondering how uncertain you were when you heard him say Nigerian authorities are not unaware of this. He calls it underhanded move, and according to him, it is there a forest close to Sokoto where they wanted to establish a terrorist stronghold known as Black Rawa. Now, if he says there is a possibility that Nigerian authorities are not unaware of this, do you think there should be an investigation into this? And I'm asking because just today, the Arewa Youth Federation also claimed that some Nigerian politicians are exploiting the political crisis in Niger Republic to undermine President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's government.
Oh, yeah, in this kind of environment, you cannot discount any bit of information. There might be fifth columnists hanging around the corner, even in, around the international corners, trying to achieve some selfish ends at the expense of our sovereignty, at the expense of the Nigerian state. This is not something that we can easily, or we should rather easily discountenance. But it's up to the security agencies, you know, to investigate, not to rest on their hours, not to take anything for granted, to double check these matters. But the overarching picture we should focus on is the picture of our sovereignty, you know, the strength of our entity, and the future and stability and sustainability of our country. And if we're looking at all those other factors, you know, if we put them in the matrix, we will know that we will just imagine that Niger Republic shouldn't be, their tantrum shouldn't be one that should bother us so very much. You know, it shouldn't be something that should distract us from our domestic priorities. You know, our priorities around economy, you know, the injection of credibility, transparency into our electoral process, you know, and of course the peace and prosperity of our country. There will be fifth columnists. There are ways in which politicians, you know, and different sections of the society may want to take advantage of a foreign attack, even though it's just verbal. You know, these things can happen, but again, the state can always be very, very powerful. And there's no way I can imagine us undermining the Nigerian state, the ability of the Nigerian state to deal with these things, whether they are overt or covert. But in the meantime, we should just be strategic, you know, and not be overly reactive. You know, we need to be matured. You know, we need to be guided, privileging the importance of diplomacy over open conflict. You know, whether physical or verbal.
All right. Before we expand this conversation, Prof, you know, a well-known aphorism says, "He who alleges must prove." Would you say the honors is a journey to come forward with evidence of his claims? Are there any consequences peradventure he cannot defend these unguarded claims?
Well, I can imagine that you asked a couple of questions, but I barely could hear you. But from what I can piece from what you said, you were talking about evidence, okay?
Yes.
And I don't think that the leader of Niger will be concerned about evidence. He has achieved the purpose that for which he made that statement. The purpose is simply propaganda. And of course, in a kind of conflict like this, in a kind of subtle disagreement like this, you cannot discount the importance of propaganda. You know, it's just meant to shift the information, to deploy information, messages, and pronouncement against us. And I'm not sure he's going to go beyond that. You know, propaganda can be very, very disturbing. You know, we are giving what it is, but sometimes we also say it's actually legitimate because it's systematically disseminating information for the benefit of the sender to the receiver. In this case, he is the sender and we are the receiver. And we have pushed back a little bit by denying. We have had the military hierarchy denying it. The Nigerian state has also denied it. These are the basic things we're supposed to do, nothing more. It's just an intangible, even though it can be very painful and distracting. But I also know that it can't go beyond that, because in terms of might, we are much more than they are. But even against all that background is something that is even much more important. Remember, I talked about how homogeneous we can be at the level of culture, tradition, and history, and how illustrious they are in bearing the glorious ancestry of some African empires, Mali Empire, the Kanem and Borno Empire. So those things, are bonds that we cannot deny. And if you look at those things, looking at those things, of course, it should hold us back, from being unnecessarily confrontational with a country that is on the lower rung of all economic indices. We may have our own troubles, we may have our own trials, but you cannot put us on the same pedestal in terms of growth and development at the level of Niger. We are a big brother, and our future is probably better together than continuous disagreement. And of course, that's what I think has influenced President Bola Tinubu's disposition towards them over this month, trying to use diplomacy, trying to plead with them to rather return to ECOWAS and not to take the inglorious part of exiting just because they want to protect their illegitimate military regimes.
A decision has now been made on whether or not Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger would be accommodated back into the region. What we know for now is that these three countries will stop being members of the ECOWAS from January 29, 2025, going by Article 91 of ECOWAS Treaty. But a duration of 6 months has been given from 29th of January to 29th of July to reconsider their decision to exit the bloc. Now, what is the overall impact of this on the regional body, mobility and integration of the bloc?
Well, I think it's not really very strange. Once more, if you look at it critically, they are just acting from the position of being hemmed at the level of ideology, governance ideology that is, once more at the level of a regime that is losing steam in global affairs. And before they took their decision, you'll be aware, you remember the ECOWAS hierarchy, had been very forthcoming in sending representatives to these countries to return to democracy. And they were actually dilly-dallying, delaying ECOWAS emissaries, trying to reduce the importance of those visits until they finally decided to exit the bloc, forming, an imprecise alliance of Sahel states, a kind of novel association that probably have a presence, but may not have a future, as the case could be. It's not something I believe will really last. It's just a stopgap measure to shield themselves from the pressure the rightful pressure tactics of ECOWAS, trying to get them back to democracy. And of course, perhaps if we want to put it in a primitive way, they just want to enjoy this pulse of power as much as possible, without thinking of handing over, without thinking of constitutional democracy. And of course, they've seen ECOWAS as a body that is trying to push them to do otherwise. So the easy, primitive way for them, action for them to take is to say they are pulling out. But against that bargain as well, you cannot we cannot imagine any other way that ECOWAS can intervene other than to appeal to reason, to make them, to change their minds, considering a shared history once again, and how the body has been together over many years. This is the first time we are having three countries pulling out at once. The first time it happened was Mauritania. But even at that, Mauritania sought to come back, and it was readmitted in observer status. But for three countries to pull out at once, it's actually a new dimension to it, but it's also not a dimension that cannot be, not an unfortunate dimension that cannot be surmounted. Now, how can ECOWAS surmount it? We made the diplomatic error of threatening to attack them to enforce democracy. That's fine. We never carried out that threat. That's okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that as well. Sometimes in policy making and pronouncement, you may make a statement or you may make a projection, then you beat a retreat. It just shows that reasoning, superior reasoning has prevailed, and I'm sure that was what happened. That was what Nigeria and maybe ECOWAS did as a whole. But going forward, there's nothing much ECOWAS can do other than to continue to appeal and just hoping again that they would not, those three countries will not plunge their countries into deeper crisis, because we know that military regimes is often, embedded in different levels of acrimony, because there might be other interest group from among them, that feels, that resents the presence of a particular set of people. And oftentimes, what does it lead to? Coups and counter-coups, and eventually conflict and wars. But we just imagine this will not be the turn that those three states' experience will be.
All right. But, Prof, I hear that withdrawing is easy, but coming back is not automatic any longer. Could that be the reason ECOWAS has given these countries 6 months to think it through, so they do not go through the rigorous process of rejoining the bloc? Could their withdrawal have reputational consequences for ECOWAS? And I'd also like to know if you saw this coming.
I never saw it coming, but I'm not also surprised. And of course, in global international diplomacy, sometimes you do not bother much about ego, about putative pride, or some kind of prestige. Those things have a way of petering out with time. What ECOWAS is doing is not to show that it's not a sign of weakness or a sign of being Lilliputs, that they're probably just trying to diminish themselves. I think it's just a matter of maturity, a matter of demonstrating that we recognize that you still remain our brothers, even though you are disagreeing with us. And there cannot be any end to the demonstration of maturity. There cannot be end to diplomacy. It's just that you can also decide to be smart in diplomacy. Diplomacy has different variations. Sometimes you can resort to gunboat. Sometimes it can be subtle. There are different dimensions of it. And what I think ECOWAS will be doing in the future is to vary their approach to resolving this crisis, also bringing back, these three outliers, outliers in terms of countries, really, and I see them pursuing this route, really, because the part of physical conflict, the part of war, is not a part that will pay anybody, which is why 45 years, for instance, after the end of the Second World War, we haven't had any other kind of war, despite close shaves that we have had, because nations have never profited from war. Nations, have only succeeded in writing their histories, at great cost, faced with war. And no region, no country will prioritize that over peace, And, of course, peace is priceless. There's nothing can be too much, to drive at peace.
And, Prof, I asked if you saw this coming. I asked if you saw this coming because many had expected the leaders of these three countries to have returned to the bloc, especially because these are still struggling countries. How will you describe that option for the countries involved? Do you think it's in their best interest? And I'm asking because concerned stakeholders like yourself won't stop saying a withdrawal would neither be good for them nor for ECOWAS. And I know that in international diplomacy today, strength lies in numbers. And some say if we remain 15 member states, influence in international diplomacy is greater. If they leave, ECOWAS will be weakened. This is something the bloc must consider. Isn't it, Prof?
Yeah, it's actually concerning, but not especially worrisome. When we want to talk about numbers, we have seen situations where countries are not more than 5 coming together, and they have done very well. ECOWAS is not the only regional bloc that we have in Africa. There is the East African region. There's one in East Africa. There's another one in Southern Africa. And I doubt if their numbers in both cases are up to the 15-member ECOWAS nation as it then was. So if 3 are pulling out on the ground of recalcitrance, on something, just because we know, for a reason that we know is obviously wrong, it's probably also a lesson for ECOWAS, the remaining countries in ECOWAS, to strengthen their union, and to be much more focused on their protocol. And one protocol is one prime point in ECOWAS protocol is the deepening of democracy. What about nations within the West African region, the remaining countries in ECOWAS, that are still trying our democracy, that are still challenged, by the crisis of legitimacy? What are they going to do to strengthen it and to give a picture of a transparent, credible democracy that is characterized with integrity? All these things should rather be their focus, because these three countries that are exiting have also given reasons. I've also cited examples of how coups have been happening in other ECOWAS countries. Coups may not necessarily be seen again in the light of military takeover. It can be a constitutional coup. It can as well be an electoral coup, not just military takeover. These three exiting countries have referred to constitutional coups in the West African sub-region. They have also referred to electoral coups, directly or indirectly. So what the message it is sending is for the remaining countries in West Africa, to strengthen their democracy, ensure that constitutional coups become a thing of the past, ensure that electoral coups, so to say, become a thing of the past. And what do we mean when we talk about electoral coup? We're simply saying elections that are frauds with irregularities, that fail to meet the test of what an ideal election should be, and the test of transparency, the test of credibility, and the test of integrity. And when we talk about constitutional coup, what are we talking about? Changes in government that does not meet, the ideal constitutional requirements, where there are tenure elongation, undue tenure elongation, changes in constitution just to suit the government or a particular person in power. These are the questions that ECOWAS will also need to ask and respond to appropriately, so that, naysayers, or people who want to take undue advantage of these imperfections, are prevented, like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are trying to do. Otherwise, I don't think ECOWAS should shirk its elevated responsibility of trying to sustain the art of diplomacy, insofar as it is not duplicitous. If it is elegant diplomacy the way we know it, I think it is the right way to go, really. All right.
So, Prof, earlier you talked about the kind of crisis this may portend for these countries. So let's break it down, because if you look at the amount of trade creation, diversion and trade effects generated through the removal of tariffs on imported goods, expectedly there should be, or there would be, a shortfall. For instance, Niger, among its counterparts, generated $49.9 million from trade creation due to ECOWAS policies, providing new opportunities for trade within the country, and Nigeria being its closest partner in the region. On the other hand, Burkina Faso generated $4.2 million trade through the removal of tariffs on import goods. Nigeria also ranks second for total trade effect due to the removal of these tariffs. Now, all of these figures are expected to go down. Do you foresee more economic crisis in the sub-region as a result of this?
Yeah, no doubt some of these variables will come into play, but remember also that the three countries are smart enough to say that free movement will still be guaranteed, that other West African countries are still free to come into their territories, as the case could be, as it was prior to their exited, but of course at the level of economy you expect that, there will be some disadvantages like you have rightly highlighted. Remember again that these countries are also dealing with the question of being landlocked. We know the disadvantages of being a landlocked country, so yes, there will be losses on both sides, but I dare say that the losses will be more on the part of these countries than on our part, on the part of the remaining countries. They are probably also trying to take advantage of the support they are getting from the East, principally from Russia, but we also know the role of Russia, how Russia's influence is declining in global affairs. They are also strained, hemmed in with their continuous intractable war with Ukraine, which has actually been very draining. We know the effect that is having, and against that background, we know there's a limitation or an extent to which they can continuously support these three countries. So saying that they want to continuously be military also isolates them further, from the much more helpful Western institutions and countries, so that eventually they'll be losing a lot, from these other countries. And we are likely to get sympathy from these Western institutions too, irrespective of their own limitations in supporting countries on the African continent. Yes, there will be minuses and pluses on all the sides, but I think that the disadvantage is going to be more on their side than on the rest of us.
Unfortunately, Prof, the decision of the three countries to leave ECOWAS will significantly impact their trading partners for a long time. And another question is, just three nations at the table, to what extent can they thrive and have economic independence, considering their landlocked area? But Prof, is this ECOWAS giving up too early? And I put it that way because just about last year, the three Francophone countries accused ECOWAS of unfairness, injustice and intolerance since their suspension, and noticeably also their withdrawal was, and is still gradually having significant repercussion on the stability of the region. Was there enough effort on the part of the ECOWAS to bring them back?
Yeah, I don't think that ECOWAS has actually given up. Regimes come and go, administrations come and go, governments come and go. And that's why I said earlier that the action is not something that is sustainable. We can have different sets of governments in the respective countries tomorrow or the day after, next week or next month, and rethinking things through, redefining positions and coming back and forth, within for the benefit of ECOWAS, So, but it's difficult for me to just imagine anything else that ECOWAS could do in the circumstance, other than diplomacy. And being diplomatic sometimes does not mean that you are weak. It just shows that you are demonstrating the higher level of wisdom and a limited level of intelligence, And of course, if we have 13 or 12 other African countries coming together and say, okay, this is a step that we're going to take, which is that to give them a long rope to pull, and they are saying, no, yeah, what more can we do? So, yeah, I think there will be a rethink on their part. It's just a matter of regime change, and regime change in a military regime is highly unpredictable, highly dangerous, fraught with anxiety, and that's why the actions stand condemnable. It's not justiciable, it is immoral, it's negligent of the collective will and aspirations of African people, particularly the West African region.
The window for the three nations to reconsider their decision will close in July 2025, 6 months after the official exit. And ECOWAS will now permanently remove their names from its list. It only means that what will be left for the regional bloc is how to avoid losing other members in the future. The alliance of Sahel states may not be fully there yet, but you may want to agree with me that its presence is capable of influencing other Sahel states like Chad, Mauritania, to become members. For instance, AS is a sub-regional bloc that talks about a primary focus on strategic cooperation and economic growth within the Sahel region. Also, we've seen the military governments supporting each other against ECOWAS sanctions. Are you worried that this disagreement may open more doors for other regional member states currently under military rule to join AES, able to exercise their military power?
Yeah, I don't think that we will rest on our hours. We'll just continue them to ride the rough shots, traveling on the dangerous path that they are traveling. I want to believe that West African efforts will not solely be focused on these three countries. We also have relationships with some of these countries that you mentioned, and of course we will be talking to them, trying to befriend them. And remember that one main characteristic of African countries is heterogeneity. There are different tribes and religions and cultures and customs, embedded within the continent, and even much more so in the West African and Central African sub-regions. Remember, we're also products of colonial powers, English, French, and Portuguese, which brings about substantial differentiations. So homogenizing us at the level of imagining that these three countries can befriend other countries just to spite us may not be that easy, because we are much more, the remaining countries are much more. They should also step up efforts in trying to befriend these other countries that they are likely to go to. But remember again that these three countries are trying even much more, to gain legitimacy, to stabilize and sustain their stay. So that's going to be much more preoccupying, for them. A difficult thing to do, considering the unpredictability of their reign, and of course the restlessness of the peoples and the problems they are having in terms of the jihadists' continuous disturbance of their identities and all of that. Those things are going to be much more preoccupying, and they're going to lack the ability, for sustained elegant diplomacy in the manner in which I imagine other countries remaining in ECOWAS will be able to do.
All right, Prof. Thank you very much for your perspectives tonight. It's been interesting having this conversation with you. Professor of Communication Studies, Bayes University, Abiodun Adeniyi. Thank you so much for joining us, Prof.
Thank you.